My name is Eileen Donahoe. I am the Executive Director of Stanford's Global Digital Policy Incubator. And I need to say, on behalf of all of the sponsors of this conference, the Hoover Institution, the Human Rights Foundation, Stanford HAI, and Stanford GDPI, we just welcome and thank Eric Schmidt for being here and for taking the time to be part of this program. It is such a great opportunity for us to have a chance to have this ranging conversation with you about technology, competition, national security, governance, and values. I will do this very quickly. Eric is one of those people who needs so little introduction. Here is the short version. He's a technologist, entrepreneur, and philanthropist. He joined Google in 2001, helped grow the company from a Silicon Valley startup, which is hard for us, any of us, to remember, into what it is today, a global leader in technology. And he worked alongside founders Sergey Brin and Larry Page very effectively. He served as Google's chief executive officer and chairman from 2001 to 2011, as well as executive chairman and technical advisor. In 2017, Eric co-founded Schmidt Futures, which is a philanthropic initiative, and he currently serves as chair of the U.S. Department of Defense Innovation Advisory Board. So welcome, Eric. Thank you so much for being here.
So let me say thank you, Eileen. You and I worked together for almost 20 years on these sorts of things. I decided to join, and I brought my pet behind me. So let's go ahead.
Welcome, pet. So I want to start with kind of a level setting. The argument has been made that in the 21st century digital context, economic power, military power, geopolitical power, and even normative power all derive from dominance in digital technology. China's stated goal is to be the world's AI superpower by 2030. Many studies using a variety of different metrics indicate that the US is still dominant in AI, but what is less clear is whether that will be the case for long. So let me begin by asking, what do you think are the right metrics for assessing the relative power in AI? And how likely is it that China will achieve its goal of surpassing the US by 2030?
So we've been looking at this pretty hard, and the general consensus is that the leading research is still done in the US, and that China is in the process of catching up. If I were to give you my personal opinion, I would say we're a year or two ahead of China. We're not a decade ahead. Mm-hmm. And it's important to emphasize this very clearly. The diffusion of the ideas, and in particular the algorithmic ideas and the software ideas, is so rapid now that you can't sort of invent AI at the equivalent of a Manhattan Project and then say, okay, we're going to keep all of these people in Los Alamos. It just doesn't work that way. So you're going to need a strategy to stay ahead that does not involve completely restricting the free flow of ideas. And I think it's pretty clear what that strategy should be, but we're in a contest. And part of the reasons I think that China may win is that they have 5 times as many people. They're very focused on STEM education. They have incentives now in their research community for people to publish papers. This is not, so the quality may not be there, but numerically they're there. And they have a stated central planning goal of dominance by 2030. Another scenario, another question would be asked: if America invents something, should we restrict it? Right. So this sort of classic answer is, okay, let's not give it to them. And the problem with that argument is that if you don't give it to them, they'll just make a copy in the next 1 to 2 years because they'll catch up. The same does not appear to be true in semiconductors. It appears that in software, we can't really bottle it up, but it may be possible to restrict access to certain semiconductor technologies, which I won't go into, which may be more difficult for them to catch up. So if you think of it as a competition, the only way we can win is by doing what we do well and doing more of it. And there's a set of things we have to do, but that's fundamentally where we are competitively.
I mean, one small follow-up is what's the role of data and the scale of data? And how important is that to the quality of the innovation in AI?
So many people believe that China will win because they have no privacy restrictions and they have attempts to put large amounts of data together. They have, for example, a biobank proposal, which is a much, much larger biobank than is currently anticipated in the West for a number of reasons, including privacy. It's not completely clear that that's true because there are plenty of people working on algorithms that require less training data to achieve the same learning. So I would say that the advantage at the moment is for China in terms of its data aggregation. That advantage may be less than people think. It's very clear that brain power, algorithmic advantage is profound. In case you're wondering what an example is, as you know, the Trump administration has banned a bunch of software apps and funding and so forth. And TikTok is part of that. And the Chinese government, after one of these bans on a Thursday, on a Friday, announced a ban on the exporting of the TikTok AI algorithm to the United States. To my knowledge, this is the first time that the US government has banned an app inside of the US, and China has returned the favor by banning the export of the algorithm to the United States. It's normally the reverse.
Yeah, it's getting quite interesting there. So I'm going to scare the audience a little bit. Help paint a picture for us. What would it look like? What difference would it make if China does exceed us in AI in terms of national security, economic competitiveness, and also the power to shape the international order?
So the reason people are so profoundly focused on the AI question is that AI is an enabler to everything else. And so let's say you care about material science, or you care about biology, or you care about chemistry, or you care about quantum chromodynamics, or you care about national security surveillance. All of these problem areas, right, have canonical and difficult classical problems that are solved in a different way using AI. I'll give you an example. I funded a fantastic group at Caltech that is doing research on climate change and clouds. And I did not know, but clouds are really important for climate change, and they're extremely difficult to model. There's a set of equations, generally known as the Navier-Stokes equations, which are incomputable at a certain scale with our current technology, right? So what you do is you use AI to approximate the clouds in their algorithms. Mm-hmm. And you sit there to go, oh, no big deal. It's a huge deal because it allows them now to do science that they couldn't before. That narrative is repeated hundreds and hundreds of times. So the reason we're so obsessed about American leadership in AI at the algorithmic level for sure is that those are the enablers for progress in virtually everything else.
Very interesting.
And that I think is missed. We looked pretty carefully at this question. The other one is essentially software platform and semiconductor leadership. Yeah. Because along with the AI algorithms, you need faster processors, bigger data stores, and those sorts of things. And again, there's lots of evidence that China understands this. We are well ahead of China in the semiconductor race at the moment. This has been studied very thoroughly by experts in semiconductors, and there is a huge program inside of China to catch up.
Yeah. Okay, so now I want to turn a little more directly to themes at the heart of the program. So the animating energy behind this whole conference is concern about the global trend toward digital authoritarianism and China's role in it. But by digital authoritarianism and China, we mean three things. One is China's utilization of digital tech for repression at home and role modeling those uses and applications to others. Second is China's export of technologies of repression, as well as the export of digital infrastructure like Huawei 5G, through which they can suck up data and bring it back to China. And the third piece is China's increasing sophistication in international diplomacy, which was written about yesterday in the Wall Street Journal, I think, and shaping global norms in their own image, and especially their growing influence in international tech governance and standard setting bodies. So first question here, on the export of digital infrastructure. Give us your assessment of the international debate over Huawei. What are the risks to the United States and others of embedding Chinese 5G technology? And where do we stand in terms of a strong Western alternative to Huawei?
So let's talk specifically about 5G. So we collectively screwed up in the race to 5G. China, about 3 years ago, gave 200 megahertz of spectrum to each of the three major telcos in China with a build-out requirement. And China is on its way with mid-band services, which are between 3 and 6 gigahertz, to have pretty ubiquitous 5G. Their goal for this year is 120 million handsets. I don't know about you, Eileen, but I'm waiting for my high-speed 5G service here where I live. And perhaps everyone else in our audience is waiting as well.
Yep.
America led with the 4G LTE standards, and we benefited enormously by virtue of the speed increase, the latency decrease, and the other services. The same argument is true for the evolution of 5G. 5G in particular has technologies inside of it which allow for very tight coupling, so-called isochronous operation, which will allow not just IoT, but also real-time IoT where everything's interacting in low latency environments. So ignore whether you want it for the speed, or you want it for the efficiency, or you want it for the latency, or you want it for its increased security, you want 5G. And we are in a position to lose that race. The reason we're doing that is we did not get the right frequencies in the right place. As a technical aside, there is now a discussion in the public about having the DoD, which operates some of those frequencies, to share with preemption for the military, obviously, to using dynamic spectrum sharing some of those frequencies, which I'm involved. And that's a potential solution to this problem. Maybe there are others. Going back to your question about Huawei, Huawei is well known to have, either through error or through malfeasance, set up a situation where information was going to places that you didn't know when you were a user. That's why everyone's so concerned about Huawei. Huawei is the leader in 5G because of the MIMO antennas that they created. And American firms largely left that space. The current leaders are Samsung, Ericsson, Nokia, and a few others. And so we've got a problem where, in addition to not having the industrial base, we don't have the economic structure nor the frequencies to do this. So this is a very serious national security issue for the United States. And you could imagine if we can't solve this problem, China would get a core platform lead that we would be behind, which would be bad. And if we were then forced to use some of their platform, we expose ourselves to certain security risks.
Yeah. So it sounds like you're not too sanguine about the possibility of the United States catching up, and maybe we have to depend more on Europe to lead in this space.
Well, the Europeans have similar problems at a smaller scale. So there's not a good European alternative to this for similar reasons. It requires the frequencies, the money, the operators, and so forth. I think there is a path, which I've been proposing, which involves trying to use this spectrum sharing. It's unclear to me whether that's going to happen or not. If that doesn't happen, then we'll have to come up with some other solution. Every month matters. So every month, while we're sitting here dithering, China is busy building this 5G network. And the reason this is important is not because I want your connection to be faster, which I obviously do, but because it enables a huge generation of new entrepreneurs, new startups, and so forth on top of this 5G platform. I'd like them to be Western-based.
Yeah, so that's a big one. So I want to go to this question about China's influence in tech governance and standard-setting bodies. Senator Mark Warner has spoken very eloquently in a recent NDI speech about the link between U.S. leadership in tech and the ability to project our values. And his essential point being that dominance in the technology can translate into the opportunity to embed our values in tech standards and protocols for the next generation of technology. The same is also, unfortunately, true for China. So my question is, which aspects of Chinese influence in tech governance, standard setting realm are most concerning to you? And in particular, how significant is this China Standards 2035 initiative? Is that getting much traction?
Well, one of the things China does is they announce these broad strategies for their bureaucracy. And you can never tell if that's what they're really doing or they're doing something else. And by the way, we probably do the same thing to them and confuse them. There's a standard body called 5G PPP, I think is the name of it, which has majority Chinese control, which is setting the 5G standards. So whenever you see the Chinese taking a majority role in setting a standards body, that's probably a pretty significant comment on their industrial policy. I want to go back to what Senator Warner said, because that is exactly what I agree, and I agree completely with him. Let's just review Android, ARM technologies which were available to China and are under restriction from the US government and unlikely to be further adopted by China. The fact that the Android operating system is the primary basis for the majority of the mobile phones in China is a net win for America, because it means that the values that were developed in the Android team, which are essentially based on open source and Linux and so forth and so on, are all intrinsic there. Now, the way it works, of course, is China can take that open source platform and they can change it. And indeed, they are doing so. And recently, this week, China announced that they were going to pursue antitrust action against Google, which I found humorous since Google doesn't really operate in terms of search in China. So it's an example of the tit for tat that's going on.
Yeah.
So I'm in favor of a different model, which is a little bit harder to explain, and it's called a rivalry partnership model. And my perspective is I would like America to win. Mm-hmm. And the best way for us to win in these technologies is to have global platforms which are also used by China. And if this is difficult to understand, then understand that that's precisely what China is doing to us with Huawei. Okay. In other words, they're trying to get Huawei to be a uniform standard globally. Yes. And then therefore the values that are intrinsic in the way they operate, which are subtle and important, become part of the way we operate. One of the greatest things about American technology firms and research and so forth is that these products are made with a certain kind of set of biases and values. And I would never want to give those things up. We can debate what they are, but I think intrinsically we know that they involve general openness, general freedom, a general bias toward communication, a general bias against censorship, and so forth.
Great. Okay. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about Trump administration policies toward China. And also this broader conversation about the so-called great tech decoupling, which you started to get into, and then we'll get more into that. So China has obviously become a gigantic focal point in U.S. political debate. And the Trump administration has sent a clear message that we are being tough on China. This message has obviously tapped into a deep vein of appropriate public concern about China. And in fact, there's been fairly strong bipartisan support for this sort of hardball approach and rhetoric. That said, a lot of people have questions about the efficacy of the specific policies coming out of the Trump administration. And this was touched upon in the panel before. So in recent weeks, there's been a lot of drama about the executive order on TikTok, the potential deal with Oracle and Walmart that was somewhat confusing, the preliminary injunction on Sunday in a U.S. federal district court prohibiting the ban, at least temporarily. Another executive order on WeChat, where my understanding is a lot of U.S. companies lobbied against the executive order for the reason that so many companies, U.S. companies, do rely on WeChat for payment inside China. And then most recently was the Commerce Department announcement last week that put SMIC, the Chinese semiconductor manufacturing company, on the trade blackout list, and basically prohibiting U.S. companies from exporting anything to them. without a license. So help us tease out the relative importance of any of these policies. What are the risks from your point of view of TikTok, WeChat, and SMIC?
So let's start, let's parse this out as follows. I think a simple model of what's going on is the White House is using a sledgehammer when it would be better to use a scalpel. And so one way to understand the sledgehammer is that every interaction that is strategic is being shut down. And you want to say to yourself, when you shut down that interaction, what then happens? And in every case, it leads to replication, duplication, or theft of what we're doing and copied in China. You say, no problem. Okay, that's okay. It's not okay. And the reason is that when these platforms begin to diverge, which is what you're describing, the divergence, they begin to be different. And once they're different, they cannot be put back together again. So the political agenda, which I understand, which is the sledgehammer and sledgehammer, you could achieve the same objective with a scalpel. So let's go through the specifics. In the case of TikTok, if the concern was data localization, and it's relatively straightforward to require TikTok to keep its data in a US cloud company and then operate the company, but knowing that the data is restricted in terms of the way it's been dealt with. There's all sorts of laws about misuse of data and so forth, and the company would be liable. It appears to me that in the negotiation, that's what they've ended up doing. The reports I've read indicate that the majority company will be owned by the parent and that the minority will be Walmart and Oracle, who will be providing cloud services. And the cloud services, by the way, current provider is Google. So if you can think of this as a shift of business from Google to Oracle, which is a competitive issue and presumably fine, under pressure from the president. And there's no real change in the status. So in other words, we went through this whole exercise, end up in a reasonable outcome, which we could have just said right at the beginning. So it's the sledgehammer instead of the scalpel. And so now we establish this principle. And so now every European country demands that the United States services, starting with Facebook, be data normalized. And therefore we have to agree to that too, because we demanded it from China. So again, this is the scalpel argument. Now, again, you see the thinking. If you look at semiconductors, and semiconductors are a real issue, the blocking of specific high-value chips to Huawei, which definitely had an impact on their handset business, will cause them to make copies. The blocking, as I mentioned, the blocking of new versions of Android and what are called Google Management Services will now force a domestic Android competitor, which will diverge. So you want to be careful to not screw up the global platforms. And so that's where the scalpel things. You want to be willing and tolerant of local demands of control, but you don't want to break the platform globally, which is what's underway right now.
Well, so right there, let me ask this question. What I'm hearing is that we want them to depend on our chips rather than develop competing alternative standards and their own. So my question about this Commerce Department blacklist, which is basically prohibiting the sale or export to their company that's trying to compete so that they, in theory, can't compete and they are even more dependent on us. What do you think about that?
I think that logic probably doesn't hold. The result of the blacklist is, of course, they'll become a competitor in their own right, which is not good for the tech companies. I think that the WeChat example that you used is particularly illustrative. It turns out that there was a ban on apps on American mobile phones, which also had the property that it prevented Apple products, which are very popular in China, from being installed with and in their app store in China having these applications, which of course makes those products unsellable in China. So again, scalpel versus sledgehammer.
Yeah. Just
So-
what about, oh, go
So-
ahead.
So the principle I'm trying to articulate is
Yeah.
America wins not when the sledgehammer goes and we decouple. America wins when we are the global platform supplier for everyone, including China, which means we know what they're doing. They're using our stuff. It's imbued with our values, all the things the senator talked about. And America wins because that's a much bigger market. It allows us to have a larger audience. Now, in order to do that, and it's important to mention that we have to do some other things, research funding, foreign students, and things like that, which we can talk about. But I'm concerned that we're both decoupling and also harming our global platforms and the things that were the seed corn that made all of us so successful.
Yeah, so the trend is definitely in this direction of this broader decoupling. You're partially saying it's political rhetoric. The sledgehammer is partially just for political purposes. And it's driving us apart in ways that could be harmful to the United States.
Put it another way, I'd like to play chess. And so when you're playing chess, you have to think 2 or 3 moves of your opponent ahead. That's how sort of chess is done, right? We all understand this.
Yeah.
So you have to remember that China has announced that they want to be dominant in a number of industries. And they actually, let me read it to you. In October 1st, they announced their intentions to lead the world in a broad swath of technology, including quantum communications, supercomputing, aerospace, 5G, mobile payments, new energy vehicles, light rail, financial technology, and of course, artificial intelligence. Right? That's like our whole world, right?
Yeah.
So,
but the idea is that we are sort of motivating them through this sledgehammer approach to drive further in that direction.
yeah, and you could argue against my position by saying they're going to get there anyway, and so why should we help them? And my argument is in these cases, at least for global platforms, we're helping ourselves.
Yeah.
And I really believe this. And I think that if in fact the world decouples in these platforms, roughly 40% of the communications infrastructure would be under China. We can debate those numbers, but it's on the order of that. So you could imagine a situation where the entire information platforms of the world are divided into 2. A Western one, which has sort of this American bias, and then the China and the BRI countries, which is like about 63 countries. And China is very clever with respect to this because they install these technologies in countries with preferred financing. They undercut their competitors. And of course, with that, they get the surveillance state and the other things that have been discussed in our conference already.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I have a question here that along those lines that I was going to say for the end, but let's just go right to this. This idea of rebuilding the democratic alliance around digital technology and values. We've watched as the transatlantic alliance in particular has deteriorated over this administration for lots of reasons. And in some ways, we've sort of never quite recovered from even the Snowden revelations. And tidbits like the United States is surveilling Angela Merkel's cell phone. And so European governments, including Germany, have recently turned to this concept of digital sovereignty so that they can get themselves on a path of self-sufficiency with respect to, essential digital technology. In some ways, the European desire to pull back is understandable, and there's, as I said, a lot of blame to go around. But this concept of digital sovereignty certainly works against what you're talking about, and to me is very much a mistake, not only because it further risks the splintering and fragmentation of the open interoperable internet, the original US vision, which is being deeply challenged, but it also reinforces unintentionally this China concept of internet sovereignty. I will say, in a little different view from you, some members of the national security community in the United States have sort of said it's time to let go of the open interoperable internet, global everything, because it's already splintering. It's a fait accompli. And some of them are pushing for an alternative. I'm thinking of Richard Clarke, Bob Nackey, even our own Andy Grotto has written about this, that democracies should band together, combine our data and our technology, but let the division happen. And then we have this overarching goal of developing democratic rules for data and tech use applications, and providing a much more coherent, compelling vision for democratic governance of digital society. And the idea being we could attract more countries back to us through that values-driven approach rather than the Chinese, much more coercive authoritarian model. What do you make of that vision? Is that realistic? How do you think about that in terms of your instinct that we can still hold on to this more global approach, having global standards, having the US play a very significant role in those global standards?
A lot of this depends on what you think will happen in a decade. And my guess is the antecedent of your argument is that people believe that we're on for a Cold War and eventually a real conflict with China. Mm-hmm. So if you believe that in 15 years, and that's a legitimate prediction that you can make, then you should clearly do everything that was just suggested and more. Why would you aid your future enemy? I don't agree with that scenario, but what do I know compared to anybody else? I think it's much more nuanced and much more complicated. I think a much more likely scenario is where the two large institutions, I'll call them the West and China, learn to coexist. Now, just to be obnoxious, let me point out that the French and the Germans had to have 2 world wars with enormous losses before they figured out how to coexist next door to each other. So we have history here, and I'd prefer not to go through another world war. And any real conflict with China, knowing what I know about the militaries on both sides, would be so horrendous, it's hard for me to describe. So I'm going to take the position that we're better off not triggering unnecessary conflict with China. And furthermore, that since they've laid out their agenda, which I just read to you, and they are 5 times larger, a form of partnership and alliance strategy, which, by the way, needs to include Japan and Australia and maybe South Korea, is important. So you could imagine that the term that's being used is the digital 10. Yep. There's on the order of 10 countries that collectively could operate this way. And I would argue that this is an opportunity for diplomacy, to try to do the hard work of diplomacy by taking some of the rough edges, getting the ways in which the 10 work together to be a bit more in alignment. And I think that would be a great diplomatic achievement from this administration or a future administration, because it magnifies our impact. Now, the way a foreign policy person talks about this is the following. They say China and the United States are going to set up poles, and then the middle countries are going to be forced to choose. The more we force them to choose, the more we increase the possibility of them making the wrong choice. So I want to be in a situation where the West broadly has a great alternative to Huawei, which can be sold to Pakistan and India, right? Yeah. And these are profoundly important objectives, because once the platforms are established with the values that they have, they're very difficult to change. If you look at Europe, has been relatively slow on these issues for all sorts of public policy reasons. Yeah. And I think it's time for the European leadership and the US to say, we have a common global competitor in the aspirations of China. A competitor is not the same thing as a combatant. It's a competitor, right? Yeah. Where will we partner? Where will we compete? Let me give you an example. Look at the manufacturing of consumer electronics in China. China could easily kneecap Apple by shutting down their factories, but that would destroy so many Chinese jobs that it's untenable. Simultaneously, the United States could gut Chinese manufacturing jobs by mandating that all Apple products sold in the US, and then there would be no way for Apple to get to scale. Right? So there's an example of an uncomfortable relationship.
Yep.
Right? Not the most valuable company in the world, a great American firm, right, is completely codependent in this sort of semi-adversarial way with China.
Yep.
And you've got to imagine they have one heck of a set of meetings internally in China.
Yeah.
But that's what diplomacy is. That's what rivalry partnership looks like.
Yeah.
And that's the concept that I want to get across here, that the pure decoupling causes everyone to become substandard. I would much rather have China manufacturing Apple's phones,
yes,
under U.S. intellectual property design and with American values.
Yes, yeah, I get that. That does make sense. It's very tricky to get your head around it, though. I mean, the first part of the hard diplomacy that has to happen is between the digital 10 themselves. And, as we were talking about before, there's so many tensions between the United States and Europe right now. Europe has been so focused on U.S. platforms as the most concerning bad actors in the world. They have, sort of forgotten about leading in the technology, and they've lost their ability to actually have leverage where it might matter. So I think we need to, work on that relationship and these others. But you're basically saying, don't go toward out and out, combat. Think of it in terms of, yes, we band together, but we still find ways to work with China on some things.
It's called a rivalry partnership, and the problem with it is the language sounds weak. Yeah. But in fact, it's a strong position. I want the United States to win. Okay. I want us to have the best platforms in the world. I want us to do whatever it takes. By the way, just to repeat, that involves allowing the best foreign, including Chinese graduate students, to come to the United States. And by the way, keeping them here as residents and citizens. It involves making sure that we have free trade agreements with our Western partners and keeping tariffs essentially to zero, as low as possible. It means common frameworks on the way platforms work and so forth. And within that, it should be possible to adapt to local rules and local regulations. Yep. I'm also skeptical, having worked on this for a very long time, that Europe will be able to offer a third way. It's appealing to say the Europeans, who are very, very smart, can build platforms that are distinctly different from the American ones and the Chinese ones. I don't think the evidence supports that. The evidence supports that the massive investment in China and the massive competency of China is going to continue. During the pandemic, it is very difficult for me to fly to Europe and for my European friends to fly to the United States. Meanwhile, China is apparently running along just fine, right? That can't be good for our competitive framework.
Yeah. Okay, I have sort of two last questions. One is about the need to actually work with China on other genuine transnational problems that we face.
Sure.
Whether it's climate change or, in theory, pandemics, we should be working together. And maybe say it a little bit more, that seems to work with your vision, that we keep open those lines of cooperation, certainly on shared transnational threats, in your vision of rivalry partnership, rather than going full on, we're not working together on anything.
Well, let's go through the scenario of a Cold War. So then all of a sudden, China decides just to pollute the heck out of the environment because they don't care, and we are the victims of this. I'm not suggesting that they would do that, but that's what happens in a Cold War. Mm-hmm. Imagine what happens in a hot war. So there are plenty of examples of things that we need to collaborate in. One of the more interesting ones has to do with no surprises. So what happened in the 60s was people figured out, when they played all the various games involving deterrence and nuclear, that one of the most important things to do was to have a no surprises rule. And so there are all sorts of mechanisms between all the countries, including China, to give people an alert or so forth about what's going on. So imagine a scenario where we don't have that in place, and there's some cyber thing going on and it escapes from the lab, and we think of it as an attack when in fact it was an error, right? So there's plenty of examples where we know that they're doing stuff there that's dangerous. They think we're doing things that are dangerous. We need to have sort of a, okay, guys, we're not really up to something too bad. It was just a mistake. And until we get through that reasoning, the danger to us of an accident is very high. I don't think we're going to have a war between China and the United States over Huawei or TikTok, but we could easily have one when it appears that the Chinese doctrine, which as best I can tell is to interfere with our communications network, is actually beginning, when in fact it was just a mistake.
Yeah. Okay, so for me, the last question I want to ask is, the panel before us was really about the challenges for U.S. tech companies trying to function in China and be in that market. I want to talk a little bit about the challenges for U.S. tech companies working with the U.S. government, and how you think about that. We all know that the big issue for companies in China is the coercive power of the Communist Party in terms of demanding access to data. But again, looking back at the Snowden revelations, we learned a lot about U.S. government also sucking up data from multiple previously undisclosed avenues, particularly from the private sector. And as I said, we've sort of never recovered from that, not only with Europe, but in some ways that really caused a breach between the Silicon Valley and Washington, tech sector and the government. It now seems that the pendulum has swung back, and there is a new push for U.S. tech companies to work with the U.S. government. And some, like Brad Smith of Microsoft, has even said there's a patriotic duty to work with the United States. And so I'm wondering, how do you think about that? Where does patriotic duty come into this, and how should U.S.-based but global companies be thinking about their relationship with the U.S. government?
So I remember the Snowden stuff well, because I was actually in the White House and actually in the Oval Office with a number of other executives as this was playing out. And I remember one of them giving a speech to the president, which was Obama, come in through the front door, not the back door. In other words, in a democracy, it's not okay for the security folks to be doing stuff that we don't know. Maybe it's legal, maybe it's not. We thought it was illegal. That isn't the point. The point is, it's just not okay. We can't have a collaborative environment. State your intentions, do it up front, do it under the rule of law. That's how America works. And I think that's what the Snowden stuff was all really about, right? At least in the tech sector. And that really poisoned the well. Both Amazon and Microsoft have announced very, very clearly that they will work with democracies, elected democracies, for the national security. And Google has now come along to this view after a diversion involving Maven. So I think it's fair to say that that as long as the government is upfront about what they're doing, and they can do this in a secret way with briefings and so forth and so on, the tech industry will work with the U.S. government. To me, the way to say this, the real question is, I don't want the U.S. government to hobble American competitiveness. I want the U.S. government to aid in American competitiveness. So I want to be able to hire as many high skills immigrants as possible, especially those with PhDs in math and physics we need for our AI projects. That seems like a reasonable request. Doesn't seem unreasonable. We've debated this for a year. They're even more important now in our battle for China. So there's a set of things like that. I'll give you another example. R&D funding in America is at roughly 0.7%. It's the lowest number as a percentage since Sputnik. How is that okay? The commission that I lead on AI has argued very strongly and received bipartisan support that these numbers need to increase. For America to be safe and for America to be a leader, we have to have federal funding for research, because that's part of the way the model works. I was federally funded. I'm very grateful to that. I wouldn't be here if that had not occurred. And similarly, we need access to these high skills immigrants.
Great. Well, so we are basically just past the time you committed to I don't know if you have a minute to take any questions from the audience. Where are you?
We can keep going.
Okay, great. Let's see. This is challenging. Should U.S. export licenses have global impact assessment requirements? I think that means basically human rights impact assessment requirements. And there was an announcement yesterday by the U.S. government about new rules on, exports, especially concerning surveillance technologies that can be used in authoritarian contexts. What do you think about that idea?
I think most Americans would agree that America's values, which start with this lack of surveillance, how to express it in another way, should be imbued in both our policies and our products. For the questioner, the cat is out of the bag, or whatever the metaphor you want is. And one thing for you to think about is that our industry operates on open source. Mm-hmm. So all of those incredible gains in vision that were done as part of the image network and so forth were also available to the Chinese. And indeed, our research indicates that in terms of surveillance, the leading companies are now in China. No big surprise for that. I suspect they don't really need our stuff. Maybe the question was about other countries.
Yeah. Well, there is another question here about how does the turn to digital sovereignty affect the future of open source development? And I would add to that is sort of your critique of not just digital sovereignty for one nation, but the national security vision that we have two, China and us. And I'm wondering how you would articulate how that will affect open source as an approach going forward.
I've not yet seen a coherent answer to this, but I'll posit it in the following way. Mm-hmm. A research team at Stanford working with some company invents artificial general intelligence and does so in a way that's really unique and clever. The research team wants to publish this. There's no question that this is a huge strategic issue. What do you do? I'll posit furthermore that if word gets out that this brilliant Stanford team has done it, within a year or two, China will have figured out how to do it as well. Because part of the logic here is that if you can show something is possible, the other side will then figure out they should be working on it as well. And a good example here is the atomic bomb. In 1945, the world discovered we had one. In 1949, I believe, the Russians had something similar. Mm-hmm. So how much of a gain do you get from this sort of very tight control versus running ahead? My bias, which again is I think something open for debate, is I'd rather keep running with everything we have as fast as we can to stay ahead, because I think that the window between first and second is very narrow. And that's why this open source thing is so hard.
Yeah. So somewhat related question. There are several big American companies who have set up, I believe Google and Microsoft, AI R&D projects in China. And I'm curious how you think about, or how those companies should be thinking about how they draw a line between the R&D and the fruit of that R&D when it is potentially usable in technology applications that are repressive by nature. Should they feel that sense of responsibility? Is there, which way should they be going there? Cooperation on the basic science and R&D, or should they not be doing that R&D together because of the potential application? Like facial recognition in Xinjiang, came in part from some collaborations.
Yeah, I'm assuming that we would all agree that in the case of surveillance technology, that's a technology we would not want to export leading technology out, mm-hmm. right? Because of its potential for misuse, and in particular, because it violates the values that we hold dear. Similarly, various kinds of censorship technology. It's going to get much worse. I'm sorry to be bad about this, but because of the broad ability to do misinformation, you're going to have, and that technology is already out there, it's already in open source, it's going to be very difficult to maintain a clean information space and one that's not being manipulated in a democracy or in an authoritarian country.
Yeah. It's getting worse and worse with AI generated text has the potential to take over. We were so worried about deep fakes, just the text is going to be overwhelming. All right, so if you were in a position to set U.S. strategic priorities in AI, R&D, what would you have the U.S. invest in so that we can, take our best shot at remaining a global leader?
So the AI Commission has already issued its first set of recommendations, and I'll just review them with you. A significant increase in basic research. Many of the core aspects of AI, including bias, which people are very worried about, as well as the amount of data, are not fully researched yet. They're not mature yet. There's plenty of reasons to believe that conversation is going to be a huge boon, that the kind of the ability to use GANs to approximate from a small amount of data, a much larger amount of data, has enormous positive implications. I can just give you example after example in AI. And those things are coming out of universities. So I think basically start with more money for basic research. As I've mentioned at least 3 or 4 times here, allow high skills immigrants, and in particular researchers, and particularly from China, to come to the United States and collaborate. They are critical to our research enterprise. Stanford and the HI group has proposed a national research cloud. Yep. We have endorsed that. And the reason is that while a company like Google or Microsoft or Facebook has enough resource for the large computing that is required to do these algorithms, many researchers in smaller places don't have that access. We think that will accelerate a lot of the seed corn. We've also recommended heavy work on the questions of bias and values for the reasons that are obvious. Mm-hmm. And we've also recommended strongly building alliances with the roughly digital 10.
That's great. All right, so there's the plan. I guess I want to underscore this idea of rivalry partnership and the basic idea that the U.S. needs to not use a sledgehammer, don't go down this path, the Trump path of just bashing and lacking in subtlety, and that the U.S. government should be thinking more strategically about U.S. competitiveness, which will require some level of partnership and access to the Chinese market and cooperation with them.
That's also the other thing to remember is that our U.S. military and national security infrastructure also needs to adopt AI for the work it does. Many people believe that our national security is heavily dependent upon research and future gains in autonomous systems. And I can tell you, having spent a lot of time on this, that there are enormous gains in intelligence at the national level that would be possible because of the adoption of these technologies. So in addition to doing the recommendations that I described, which sound like they're very pro-citizen, they're also good for our national security. They're good for the government as well.
Yeah.
The majority of our recommendations, by the way, are none of the ones I mentioned. Our real recommendations are talent. When you look at the system of America, there's this weird bifurcation between I'll just call it the tech people, sort of collectively the people who are on this conversation are part of Stanford, part of HAI, and an awful lot of other people who don't really understand that they're working on other things. And that gap is solved by hiring a whole generation of technically trained young people, pushing them through the promotion systems, getting them to become admirals and generals and so forth over time. And without that, the subtle trade-offs that you're describing will be missed by the people who have to make crucial decisions for our future.
Well, Eric Schmidt, incredibly provocative conversation. You certainly have made me think that I need to go back and reconsider rather than just having my sort of hawkish instincts about China. And I will definitely be thinking more about the subtleties required if we really want the United States to continue to lead. So thank you so much.
Thank you to Stanford. Thank you to you. Thank you to everybody involved with us. Thank you to Hoover.
Great. Thank you, Eileen. And thank you, Eric. I also want to say thank you to our panelists from earlier, Casey, Mega, Mary, and Alex. And of course, thank you to everyone tuning in and joining us today. What a great program, packed with valuable and lively insight into the nexus of technology and business in China, with huge implications for social media, censorship, and human rights moving forward. Hopefully, this will spark many more conversations and initiatives around these topics. Everyone tuning in, please join us again next week for part 3 of this event series, which will begin this coming Tuesday, October 6th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, with Hoover Senior Fellow Larry Diamond interviewing Mike Brown, the Director of the Defense Innovation Unit at the U.S. Department of Defense. After Larry and Mike's conversation, we will feature a panel on China as an emerging AI global superpower. And this panel will be moderated by Dominic Ziegler, who is the Economist's Senior Asia Correspondent and founding author of the Banyan Column on Asian Affairs, who also served as the magazine's China correspondent for 7 years. Panelists include Human Rights Watch Senior China researcher Maya Wang, Carnegie Endowment Senior Fellow Stephen Feldstein, and German Marshall Fund Fellow for Emerging Technology Lindsay Gorman. The conversation will center on how the Chinese government is exporting AI technology around the world. Stay tuned. Thank you, and see you then.